bumped into the New World in 1492, and they are still there. Now, this notion of placeness and taking care of one's place and being concerned about what is going on in one's place is an essential value in Native American societies. And it is a value that is totally discounted in the myth of Columbus, the myth of exploration, of constantly going on to new things. The Western worldview embraces age and antiquity as that which we have transcended. It puts it in museums. It may glorify it. It digs up Indian bones sometimes and puts them on display as evidence of dead cultures. It loses track of the continuity of those cultures. How, although things may change, there is an ongoing core of identity, and that core is very often associated with the place where we are. And even people who have been moved to different places may still retain a sense of that association with some kind of a homeland. And that is a very important thing in terms of how you take care of where you are, and in terms of how you take care of your relationships with the other people around you who share that same space with you. There's another notion in this sort of linear, constantly outwards looking that even in a time sense says there will be a beginning and there will perhaps ultimately be an end. We are working towards some goal. But there's another thing that says what goes round will come round. And when people work in cycles, and when people see what has happened in the past, and this is really a cliche in Western history, that if we do not know the mistakes of the past, we are doomed to repeat them. If we constantly look to the future without looking to the past, and if we constantly discard what has seemingly become old or obsolete in favor of what is out there and unknown, then I think we run the risk maybe of falling off the edge of our intellectual world sometime in the future. Overpopulation, degradation of the environment, the idea that if we pollute this land too badly, we can always go out and colonize Mars, yes. The sense of being in a place and being rooted and having a relationship and realizing the cycles and repetitions of things in that place provides a certain sense of security and safety, which is nurturing and which certainly can foster creativity and intellectual activity and thinking about the nature of the world, because Native American peoples have done all those things and done them quite successfully in their own places. So if I would propose a counter myth to the myth of Columbus, I might appropriate the San Ildefonso myth and say we need a grandmother spider to keep us where we are so we can take care of that place.
Good?
Yeah, why don't you go ahead?
Okay. Well, I just want very briefly, because I know I spoke too lengthy this afternoon, just to relate to two issues I think very poignantly presented to us by Peter Paris in his first presentation, which was, I think to me, excellent. One is the problem of science and modernity, and the other is the issue of the myths and counter-myths. With respect to the first one, I just want to stress what I said this morning in my comment to Clarasu's lecture, namely that we find at the end of the 15th century in the so-called encounter of two worlds or discovery of America, not only the confrontation between the European scientific attitude and the mythical perspective of the Native American, but basically a clash of two mythical worldviews. And as I call it the war of myths. These days, the diario of Christopher Columbus is rather devaluated after David Henige very brilliantly put it into the same category of the Epistle to the Hebrews, namely a rather a document somewhat rewritten and redrafted by too many hands to really believe that it came from the log of the first journey of Columbus. And now a lot of attention is being put into the famous bestseller written by Columbus in February 1493. When I studied that letter, I found it filled of myths. For example, Columbus is convinced that in the Caribbean there are two islands. One of them is Matinino, and the other is another island which he doesn't name. One island is full of anthropophagi, of cannibals. The second is inhabited by Amazons. And Columbus develops very exquisitely the idea that from time to time the cannibals, the Caribes, visit the Amazons, because the Caribes are the only men accepted, but only for very brief period of time, by the Amazons. So that after 9 months, the Amazons have either small Caribes, which they send to the Caribe island, or small Amazons, which they keep and raise as Amazons. From then on, most expeditions will try to find either cannibals or Amazons. And the whole history of the first 5 or 6 decades of the colonization is filled with this search for Amazons or cannibals. Another thing that he says is that in Cuba there is a province which, sorry, he was not able to visit, in which people are born with tails. So that was almost 5 centuries before Gabriel Garcia Marquez and 100 years of solitude. But we after reading that, we are left with the impression, how sorry we are that he didn't go to that province. And he says that there is another island in which people are totally hairless. So we have indeed in that letter an island filled with Amazons, another with cannibals, a province of people with tails, and another with people with absolutely no hair. Therefore, and I submit not only those very clearly mythical islands, but also what he says about gold with respect to La Española, which, by the way, he thinks it's extremely big island, as he thinks also that Cuba is bigger than the England and Scotland taken together, that in La Española, most of the rivers are full of gold. But he has been totally unable to study those rivers, so therefore when he says that most rivers in La Española have gold, that is not certainly a description, it's not a statement of fact, and I think it's not merely a statement, a propagandistic statement, it's a matter of the projection of the mythical conception that Columbus has of gold. And from now on, Columbus gets into a frenzy of mythopoetic production, like this third expedition. When he gets to, after Trinidad, he gets to the delta of the Orinoco, and he's totally convinced that he's very near the earthly, the lost terrestrial paradise. And then he develops the notion that the scientists of his days are wrong, that the world is not round, it's not spherical, but it's like a pear or like the female breast. So therefore it has that form with a nipple, and over the nipple is Eden. And then he developed this very peculiar cosmography, which has absolutely nothing of scientific in it. These mythical projections of Columbus is the anticipator of what I call the war of the myths. For example, you were distributing the requerimiento. If you look at the requerimiento, that's a mythical conception of the origin of humanity. And that mythical conception of the origin, which has nothing of scientific study of the origin of humanity at all, that mythical conception of the origin of humanity is contrasted to the different myths of origins, or the dialogue, debate between the 12 Franciscan missionaries in 1524 and the survivors of the Aztec nobilities, the surviving leaders of the Aztec people. The exchange is an exchange of their different mythical viewpoints. And we should say mythical because it's very easy for us to say that the Aztecs had myths, but it's not so easy for us to say that we Christians have our mythical viewpoints. In that dialogue, interesting enough, in that dialogue, confrontation between the Franciscan missionary and the Aztec princes about their different mythical viewpoints, finally, the Franciscan missionaries established the criterion to distinguish between myth. We won the war. Our God, therefore, is truly powerful. It has had a historical demonstration of our powerful God. So that, therefore, power, war, becomes the criterion for the truth of the different myths. And that's I think that's all I want to say about that point. The second point is what Peter Parks brought about. Well, okay, we are criticizing the Columbus myth. Could we develop a counter-image, counter-myth, and so on? There has been attempts. I think the most formidable attempt has been in Mexico. In Mexico, the issue is not basically Columbus, but Cortés. The confrontation is between Cortés and Cuauhtémoc. If you go to Mexico City and you go to the La Reforma Avenue, which goes from Chapultepec up to almost to the center of the city, which is a huge avenue, it's an Alameda, you find an immense, important statue of Cuauhtémoc, but you don't find any statue of Cortés. So that Cortés is considered the anti-hero, whereas Cuauhtémoc is the mythical hero that embodies the nation. It's not Cortés who's the founding figure, it's Cuauhtémoc. And that is very important for the Mexican mentality, the Mexican psyche, because Cuauhtémoc is a tragic figure. And this is this Octavio Paz has analyzed beautifully in the Labyrinth of Solitude, the Laberinto de la Soledad, how the identification with the fallen hero, with Cuauhtémoc, develops a tragic mentality in the Mexican person. The second element in Mexico is the problem of Quetzalcoatl, Guadalupe, Tonantzin. During the independence, during the war for independence, there were independentistas who tried to reconstruct Quetzalcoatl as the image of rebellion. And it did not work out. The image that finally was able to mobilize the people was the image of Guadalupe.
not of Quetzalcoatl, but of Guadalupe. Now, does that mean that the Christian European religion has taken hold of the deep roots of Mexican mentality? That might be an interpretation, but Jacques Lafaille, the French scholar who has studied the Guadalupe religiosity, thinks that not necessarily, that behind Guadalupe is Tonantzin, is the mother of the gods, and that it is basically the matriarchal religiosity under a Christian veil, so that when the Guadalupe court spread out, it was, according to Jacques Lafaille, the first step towards the independence, the cultural independence, the religious independence of Mexico. So that we find here around the figures of Quetzalcoatl, Guadalupe, Tonantzin, a convergence, a complex convergence of different figures and myths, so to say. The third element is the Malinche, Doña Marina. Malinche was a problematic figure in Mexican history, because Malinche is the Mexican, the Aztec woman who helps Cortés in the conquest of Tenochtitlan, served as an interpreter spy in favor of Cortés. She is sexually also the lover of Cortés. She has children from Cortés, although Cortés finally marries her with somebody else. She's a lover of Cortés, and she becomes the Pocahontas, the Mexican counterpart of Pocahontas, except that there was no Mexican appreciation of the Pocahontas. The Malinche was a much maligned historical figure, but it is Octavio Paz who very forcefully said we are all children of the Malinche in Mexico, and in that way there has been an attempt to recover the Malinche as the female figure who was sold by the patriarchal dominion of the Aztec society, of the later part of the Aztec society, and therefore Malinche is the tragic figure between two patriarchal and dominating hierarchies, that represented by Montezuma and that one represented by Cortés, and that therefore Malinche is in a sense a precursor of a kind of peculiar type of feminism, who is not willing to abide by the rules established neither by Montezuma or by Cortés. So that Malinche is undergoing a very important transformation from being the mala madre, from being the, well, I don't think you know Spanish, but I saw him say, the puta madre, which was what they would say, it's my puta madre, to be my liberated mother, you see. And that's very important, because in Mexico at least, I'm not Mexican, I'm Puerto Rican, but I am lover of Mexican culture, as you can see. In Mexico, this is not merely an intellectual exercise, but the figure of the Malinche, of Cuauhtémoc, Cortés, Tonantzin, Guadalupe, Quetzalcoatl, have taken out very popular dimensions and are part and parcel of the very convoluted and tragic history of Mexico. So that what I'm suggesting, Peter, is that maybe in the US you are too much US self-centered. And therefore, one way of analyzing the problem that you were posing, and we want to debunk the Columbus myth. What are we going to replace it with? You see? That we might analyze the very complex issue of the Mexican mythological self-understanding.
I should give Peter a chance to respond, but I want to get to the audience because you've been very patient. Clara Sue has pointed out that the effect of the Columbus myth on Americans of European descent has been a continuing impulse to explore, to go out, to grasp, to colonize Mars. And she encourages us to become native to this place, to know our own locations and understand them first. And Luis has pointed out that another effect of this myth on European Americans has been the idea that the reason we conquered the indigenous peoples is because we had science and technology on our hand and they only had myth. And he pointed out that we didn't have science at all, that this was a war of myths. And the reason the Europeans won was because they had guns and used violence. So with that, I would ask you to raise your questions and direct them to a member of the panel if you can.
Your last comment has brought to mind some interesting connection. The first speaker's comments about our meat-based culture, and then your comment about guns. It seems to be a very clear linkage there. I don't know who would like to comment on that. Any further connection there?
We should recall that it was in the 15th century that Europe perfected the gun and made efficient use of gunpowder and guns for the first time. Never been done before. Nobody ever thought to do such a thing before, though gunpowder had been known for centuries at that time. And Europe perfected the gun, and with the gun and the ship and the book, produced by a movable type, all three of which were perfected in the 15th century, it was able to establish the empire that it did establish. And as it did so, it became convinced that its technologies were the inevitable and just technologies, and that therefore all other technologies that were to develop were also inevitable and just. And here we are 500 years later.
David?
The comment was made that the possibility of getting a new myth is a rather daunting one, and the appropriate response is pessimism. At least that was a suggestion. But it does seem to me that, especially with the first three speakers, the appropriate response shouldn't be pessimism, but absolute despair. Because what you're criticizing, what you all seem to be exposing, is, especially the first speaker, is the utter bankruptcy and violence and horror of Europe. The European civilization now dominates the world. Well, I'm not sure if that's true or not, but if it's true, and as I said, it does seem to mandate despair. Because the image of returning to Native American myth, to tending our place, again, seems to be genuinely hopeless. So I'm wondering if I'd like to get a response to that by maybe all the panelists. But then the follow-up question I ask is, since I think despair is a response to be avoided if possible, is not to reject the European model wholesale, which is what I've been hearing, but to see if there's anything in that tradition that can be preserved and used to remedy the situation.
Well, I come from a long tradition that has abhorred despair, simply because that gives up. And And I feel that when things are made by humans, they then can be changed by humans. And my point is that it takes a long while. I think that we are rather impatient as American people, and when we see a problem, we want to get a quick fix for it. And I think that when things function myth-like, there are no quick fixes. But that is not despair, that's simply saying we work in a realistic way. It's political realism, if you like, with a long-term agenda. When I say I'm reluctant to name the type of new myth, because I think that is just too speculative. I think that myths are not developed that way. Myths grow out of the experiences of the folk, and they emerge. And one of the signs of a real, genuine myth is that you really don't know when it happened. They can't be dated because they are so enmeshed in the fabric of the people's self-understanding that they don't have dates and they don't have authors and so forth. So that's why I think that it's superficial to try to develop a new myth. But I think that one sets out the conditions, and the conditions are peoples who have been thrown together and who have brought their own traditions with them in various ways, and that these have got to negotiate a life, either a life of extreme conflict among each other, or a life of mutuality and community. And that when one does that with a genuine sense, it seems to me that the myth of origins that would develop in a pluralistic situation would draw upon the basic ingredients present in that pluralism. And that means that everybody would have a part or to contribute. But exactly what that would be, I think that we need to wait another 500 years to find out.
I would respond that talking about despair and bankruptcy to me represents something that I was talking about, which is the notion that we have reached some end point which is not changeable. As someplace on some line of progress, we have hit rock bottom and we are going to stay there, without considering the cycles and new generations and the ways in which people can teach their children new things, as Gary is proposing to do here. And we lose sight of the process in the notion of a kind of stagnation in human society. And perhaps I may be a raving optimist, but I see that cycles and the notion of return and the notion of persistence of cultural values does not preclude the fact that things can change and that there are new generations who are coming along who may be the changing agents in that process.
There is a sense in which, as Brecht said, the man who is laughing has not heard the news, and that certainly pessimism seems an appropriate response to anybody who has seriously looked at the condition of the world, and the 5.5 billion strength of the dominance of one species. Despair, however, though it could be a reasonable alternative to pessimism, would simply mean we do nothing about it. have made a great mistake. And I offer for you the idea that when you say we can't think that we should learn from the Indians that notion of living in place, but there is in fact in this country right now a movement called bioregionalism that is exactly trying to do this, that has been successful for 10 years in putting out these ideas and adopting them to a modern context. There's a considerable following for the idea of the American Indian today as an ecological model. That is an idea that I've encountered on a great many campuses, and it makes sense. And there is this to offer us some comfort. Twice before in the European experience, despite the power of the myth that led us in another direction, we were capable of learning from our perception of the Indian cultures. The first time was in the immediate contact when Columbus and Vespucci in particular put into the mind of Europe for the first time a vision of an egalitarian, communitarian, non-property utopia. And this was such a strong idea in Europe that both Columbus and Vespucci had bestsellers in what they wrote. It goes to Thomas More, and he creates, in fact, the first utopia in Europe. And it is a place which he sets in the New World, and he puts it there because that is what he has read. Europe begins with an idea of what an egalitarian society is, because it imagines that as existing in the New World. That's very important. And then when Europeans begin to settle here in any number, they bring that with them. And we see here some of the seeds of what later becomes the idea that surrounds the United States. The second time that we learn from Indian experience, and then there are undoubtedly others, but the second important time in terms of the United States history is when we are crafting the Articles of Confederation, and then after that, the United States Constitution, and a number of the important drafters of those documents upon which this nation is founded took their image of how governance should operate from the Iroquois confederacies and some other confederacies of the Appalachian Indians. And you can trace it directly, the notions of governance from what they saw the Indians doing, what they were learning about how the Indians were making a multiplicity of tribes into one nation, as the Iroquois did. And they adopted that model in making one nation out of the 13 colonies. So, I suggest to you that twice before in history, we have taken the Indians as models, and they have proved useful in crafting what we have in this country, and I don't see why we can't do it again.
Luis, did you want to comment on that?
No, okay.
Go ahead.
We keep talking about a European model. Are we talking about capitalism? I mean, I don't understand what that model is. I mean, are we talking about capitalism, or what is it? What model are we talking about?
It's Greg's quest, is it not?
Yes, it's Greg's quest. The Greco-Roman, Judeo-Christian, Western European scientific worldview into which we must indeed inject capitalism, which has been strongly associated by Max Weber with Christianity and the Protestant ethic.
We had patriarchy to that.
Patriarchy is subsumed under the Christian and Roman aspects of it. It's definitely in there, yes.
But there's an anachronism that I trust you'll all go away with, Greg's quest.
Greg's
Very
quest,
useful. Thank
remember.
you for bringing that to us.
We have time for one more question.
Mine was just more of a statement that I was sort of saying there by saying that I agree with Claire that you've got this Greco-Roman, et cetera, but I think it's very important that patriarchal be named, because I think we're in a new point in history that has never, ever been before in the Western civilization, which is that women are now
coming forth as a voice. Now, I think unfortunately a lot of women have bought into the patriarchal model, but some of us haven't, and I think we're a force to be reckoned with yet. We're part of the wild card that's got to be played yet before the new myth emerges.
In the American historical literature, it's Pocahontas, Malinche, Sacagawea. It's women who help European men who become the heroines of American history, and the Tecumsehs and the Pontiacs are the warriors, the destroyers. Nobody ever really mentions Tiganoita, who is the founder of the League of the Iroquois in their traditions. And if we talk about George Washington as a hero in American society, I think we ought to talk about Tiganoita and acknowledge not only his contributions to the model of Confederacy that the Founding Fathers used, but his legitimacy as a leader and an innovator in the Iroquois society as well.
And,
To add to your myth.
and I think, as I said, that it's very clear in the Mexican popular Catholicism that it's the Guadalupe, not Jesus Christ, who is the center of worship, by far.
On her note, we will end.
By the way, there is something I want to say. There are also moments in which the Native Americans learn very efficiently from the Europeans. There is a long discussion about what was the main factor of military superiority on the part of the Europeans. I subscribe to the view that it was the horse. It was the horse that was extremely important in the conquest of America. And it were the Araucanians and the Praria Indians and the Indians of the Pampa in Argentina that were able to at least survive for 3 centuries because they were able to learn how to use the horse and to be even superior horse riders than the Europeans. They finally, death came to them also, but their destruction on the part of the U.S. Republic and on the part of the Argentinian Republic was in the second part of the 19th century, and they were able to resist so long because they managed to incorporate the horse to their way of warfighting.
Go ahead.
I'd just like to reiterate a final point also, is that in some ways we've been talking about Indians as these wonderful, mystical, romanticized, people, and there are still Indians here. There are Indian communities in Iowa, there are Indian reservations throughout the country, and there's still a kind of cultural exchange that is going on. So please do not go away with the idea that Indians have provided the models and then quietly disappeared, because they're still out there and they're still fighting for survival.
So there may be resources even among us, maybe even in the Grec Quest. What?
Grudge Quest.
Grudge Quest. Greco-Roman, Judeo-Christian, Western, scientific, rationalist, patriarchal, racist, capitalist, terrible myth that we all inherit. I'd like to end on a more personal note, though. I started this conference series 9 years ago with the intent of looking at some rather complex questions in religious ethics, and I think no installment has brought us the kind of speakers that we have on the podium here with us tonight. You're all very lucky, whether you recognize it or not, with these 4 people, all of whom are national and international celebrities in the scholarly world. And what they've been doing is talking about myths or worldviews, which are very complex things. To understand a worldview of a people or a myth like the Columbus myth takes skills in ethics that Peter brings and skills in history, such as Kirkpatrick and Louise bring, skills in anthropology and sociology, such as Clara Sue Kidwell brings, and everything, which points out not only how difficult this task is, but how absolutely essential it is to understand ourselves. People in religious studies, for a long time, have thought that these kinds of questions are the kinds of questions that must be addressed at a liberal arts university. You can't understand the humanities if you can't understand yourself, and you can't understand yourself or your culture if you don't think about these large myths, what they are, how they've affected you, and what you ought to do about them. I don't know whether this will be the last installment of the Religious Ethics Conference or not. It may be. And if it is, I mourn for the students of Iowa State who will have to do without it in the future. But I would like you to join me in thanking these scholars for the excellent presentations they've given the last 2 days.